He walked in just wanting a slice of pie. Moments later, he was kicked out, not because of what he did, but because of who he was. What the restaurant owner didn't know, that man had a son with the power to flip the entire town upside down. This isn't just a story about racism. It's about a mistake so big it sparked a movement, shattered a legacy, and left a whole community asking, what if you messed with the wrong man and never knew it? Earl Maddox showed up at Sam's Grill the way he had every Monday for the last 20 years, with a quiet certainty and a craving for pancakes. He wasn't expecting fanfare. He didn't need his name or routine for something that had stayed the same even when everything else in life changed. What he wasn't expecting was to be denied a seat. It started subtly, with Sam pretending not to see him at first. Then the delay in taking his order. Earl waited. He always waited. But today the tension was different. Less about slow service and more about presence. Finally, when he politely asked for the usual, Sam looked straight at him and said something he hadn't heard in decades. I don't serve your kind. It dropped like a bomb, not shouted, not whispered, just said plain and solid, like a door slamming in slow motion. For a beat, no one reacted. The diner went quieter than a place full of clinking mugs and sizzling bacon should ever be. People froze, not in outrage, but in habit. A few eyes glanced up and looked away just as fast. A couple of forks paused midair. But no one said a word. Earl stood there, trying to understand whether he heard what he just heard. And when Sam didn't clarify or correct himself, he knew. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't confusion or misunderstanding. It was deliberate. It wasn't about the pancakes. Sam's Grill had always been part of the town's rhythm. People met there after Sunday service, before school board meetings, during first dates and last goodbyes. But under the Formica counters and chipped mugs was a history no one talked about. Everyone knew Sam inherited the place from his father. Everyone knew the diner hadn't always been welcoming to everyone. But they also believed, or hoped, that times had changed. Until now. Earl didn't yell. He didn't argue. He left. The way people leave when they've seen this before, quietly, with the knowledge that no amount of calm can undo what's just been done. The next table over, someone murmured something about it being Sam's right to serve who he wants. Another whispered that Earl had been coming here for decades, and yet another lowered her head and didn't say anything at all. The tension settled, not like smoke, but like concrete, thick and immovable. Sam, meanwhile, went back to the counter like nothing happened. He moved through the motions of a man who thought he'd made a decision and could now go back to normal, but nothing was normal. The diner's hum didn't return. Conversations stayed subdued. Even the waitstaff glanced toward the door every few minutes, as if half expecting Earl to come back with someone. Maybe with words, maybe with justice. No one expected what would come instead. Earl drove home in silence, the kind that filled not just the truck, but the space between decades. It wasn't the first time someone had spoken to him like that, but it was the first time it hurt this much, because it was Sam, because it was public, because no one stopped it. Sam thought it was over. He thought he had made a point. He thought, if anything, the town would quietly side with him. After all, it was just Earl. Just one man. Just one refusal. But Sam didn't know who Earl's son was. He didn't know the kind of man who'd grow up watching his father walk with quiet dignity, take disrespect with retaliation, raise a family with discipline and warmth despite every closed door. He didn't know that Earl's son was now a state senator. He didn't know that the man who'd spent the last 15 years fighting for civil rights legislation and veteran benefits had just been handed a reason to bring his entire campaign for equity straight into his hometown. He didn't know the weight of that name yet, but the town would know soon. And while Earl never planned on starting anything, he never raised a sign, never posted on Facebook, never told his story to the press, the story found its way out. Someone at the diner texted a friend. Someone else posted an anonymous account. By evening, the story had its own thread on the local subreddit. And once the pieces were in place, it moved fast. A screenshot of Sam's Yelp page showed 5-star reviews from years ago, now drowned out by 1-star comments. We don't support hate. Used to love this place. Not anymore. The local high school's history teacher posted a thread about the diner's legacy. A local veteran quietly removed his military plaque from the wall. And through it all, Earl said nothing. He wasn't looking to fight. He wasn't trying to go viral. He was trying to understand how it was still happening, still, after everything. Injustice doesn't always announce itself with banners or burning crosses. Sometimes it walks into a diner, wipes down a counter, and says, I don't serve your kind, like it's still 1963. But this wasn't 1963, and Sam had no idea how fast 2023 could move. Caleb Maddox didn't answer unknown numbers. He got too many. But that morning, as he glanced at his screen, he noticed the name of a family friend, someone who never called without a reason. He answered. The call lasted less than 5 minutes. No raised voices, no exclamations, just facts laid out plainly. His father had been kicked out of Sam's Grill, not refused a table, kicked out, told directly he wasn't welcome. Caleb didn't speak for a long time after the call ended. He just sat in his chair, staring at the headlines on his laptop, none of which seemed important anymore. By noon, his calendar had been cleared. His team didn't ask why. They'd worked with him long enough to know when something personal took priority. He booked a flight home for that evening. No press, no statement. He didn't call his father. He didn't post about it. Not yet. Caleb's return to Raleigh wasn't dramatic. He landed after dark, drove a rental car through quiet roads, and pulled into his father's driveway like he was just visiting for a weekend. But something had shifted. He hadn't lived in this town for nearly 2 decades, but the moment he stepped into his childhood kitchen, he knew. This wasn't just about his father. That night, Earl finally told him the full story. Every word Sam had said, every silence in the room, every person who looked away. Caleb didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to react. He just listened, cataloging everything in his mind like pieces of a case he would soon prosecute, not in court, but somewhere far more public. The next morning, Caleb walked into City Hall and asked to speak to the town administrator. No cameras, no entourage. He was polite, firm, direct. He asked about the town's policies on discrimination in businesses, about enforcement, about licensing. By the time he left, 3 different departments had been looped in and a quiet storm had begun to build. He didn't mention Sam's name. Not yet. He didn't need to. Meanwhile, word continued to spread. First, it was the high school English teacher who posted a thread titled "We Know Better." She didn't name Sam either. She didn't have to. Her post was about legacy, about silence, about the moments when decency should override comfort. Then came a retired Army sergeant who shared a photo of Earl from their days in Vietnam, captioned, "He risked his life for people who now won't serve him breakfast." The town started to divide, not cleanly, not loudly, but in conversations behind closed doors, in church lobbies, at gas stations and barbershops. Some defended Sam. He's old school. It's his business. Maybe there's more to the story. Others began to question what they had overlooked, and for how long. Sam, for his part, stayed silent. He refused interviews, declined to respond to online comments. He showed up every morning, unlocked the door, and tried to run his diner like nothing had happened. But customers thinned. His morning regulars stopped coming. Deliveries slowed. A couple of suppliers began sending notices that they wouldn't be renewing contracts. He started noticing the same faces outside the window. People holding signs, not yelling, just standing. One of them was a young woman named Kayla. She worked part-time at the public library and brought her own folding chair to sit outside the diner each morning before work. Her sign simply said, "We remember." When asked by local reporters why she was there, she said, "Because pretending it didn't happen is why it keeps happening." Caleb still hadn't spoken publicly, but his presence in town was impossible to ignore. He'd been spotted at the courthouse, at the public records office, at a community center hosting a town hall on small business reform. He was moving, but no one knew exactly what he was building. What they didn't see were the late-night calls, the quiet meetings with civil rights attorneys, the emails to nonprofit directors, the tracking of public funds tied to Sam's business license, the digging into Sam's financial records, which, through a web of LLCs, revealed a failing diner propped up by outdated loans and family inheritance. It wasn't revenge Caleb was after. He didn't believe in vengeance, but he believed in accountability and transparency and transformation. He wasn't just going to punish Sam. He was going to shift the entire foundation that allowed Sam to believe he could do what he did and face no consequences. Earl, watching all this unfold, kept to himself. He didn't protest, he didn't attend town meetings. He spent most of his days at home listening to the radio and watching the mail stack up. People sent him cards, letters, some anonymous, some handwritten in careful print, apologizing for not speaking up that morning, some with checks, some with notes that simply said, "Thank you for your service. I'm sorry we failed you." But even as support grew, Earl remained uneasy. He had seen what happened when anger took over a movement. He had lived through the 60s. He didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted breakfast. He wanted respect. And more than anything, he wanted his son to be safe from the backlash he knew would come. But Caleb wasn't backing down. He'd made too many speeches in too many rooms to walk away now. The question wasn't if change would come, it was how fast and how deep. And Sam Harris, the man behind the counter, still didn't understand who he had picked to fight with, or how much his life was about to change. By Wednesday morning, Sam was convinced it would all blow over. It always did. This wasn't the first time someone had taken issue with how he ran things, and in the past, the noise had faded once something else grabbed the town's attention. He figured a few days of headlines, a few uncomfortable stares, and things would go back to normal. But the silence inside Sam's grill wasn't temporary. It was systemic. His usual crowd had thinned to a couple of loyal holdouts who mumbled half-hearted greetings and avoided eye contact. His waitress, Danielle, was late again, and when she finally showed up, she didn't speak to him unless absolutely necessary. Even the local delivery guy, usually chatty, had dropped the boxes off out back and left without coming inside. Outside the diner, the crowd was growing, not in size but in persistence. The same faces showed up every morning. Different signs, same message. People stood silently, refusing to escalate, refusing to leave. That unnerved Sam more than if they'd shouted. Anger he could dismiss. Silence forced him to look. He tried to stay busy, filling ketchup bottles, wiping down counters that didn't need it. At one point, he pulled out a dusty radio from the back room and tuned into the local station, hoping for distraction. Instead, he heard the morning show host quoting a segment from the Civil Rights Commission. Something about anti-discrimination statutes in public accommodations. Sam turned it off. Down at City Hall, the town administrator was having a very different morning. Emails had flooded her inbox, residents asking for clarification on civil rights laws, business licensing regulations, and public accountability measures. Reporters had begun calling not just local ones, but state outlets. A columnist from the Raleigh Tribune was spotted taking photos in front of Sam's grill. None of this was accidental. Caleb Maddox had spent the last 48 hours quietly placing pressure on all the right hinges. He didn't shout, didn't grandstand. He worked methodically. His legal team had compiled a timeline, a list of code violations Sam's Grill had racked up over the years and skated past. Health inspection scores that had been overlooked, incomplete tax filings, even the questionable hiring practices no one had bothered to document until now. But Caleb wasn't interested in tearing Sam down for the sake of it. He was interested in leverage, because behind all of it, behind the protest signs, the legal letters, and the quiet online campaign, was a plan. And it started not with punishment, but with pressure. Enough pressure to create options, and one very specific offer. Before that, though, the town needed to feel the weight of what had happened. That afternoon, the local university held a forum titled "The Cost of Silence." It wasn't officially about Sam's Grill, but everyone knew it was. Speakers included professors, local clergy, a retired judge, and a high school senior who had started a petition calling for community-wide racial equity training. The auditorium was packed. More than half the audience had never attended anything like it before. And when a local pastor took the podium and said, "We're not here because of one man's words. We're here because too many people didn't say anything when they heard them," the room held its breath. Back at the diner, Sam noticed something new. People were walking by without looking in. The curiosity had passed. Now came the judgment. That night, he got a call from an old friend, a retired councilman who'd supported Sam's application for a small business grant a few years back. The man didn't yell, didn't accuse, he just asked one question: "Why didn't you just serve the man his breakfast?" Sam had no answer. It wasn't about the pancakes. It hadn't been for a long time. But now, for the first time, he started wondering what it had actually been about. What had triggered the refusal? What fear? What story he'd told himself so long that he couldn't even explain it when asked? He didn't like the direction his thoughts were heading. He poured himself a coffee and let the diner stay dark, even during the dinner hours. Across town, Caleb was preparing the next step. He didn't intend to drag this out. Public pressure was effective, but only if used sparingly. Too much, and people grew desensitized. What he needed now was clarity, a visible, undeniable moment that shifted the conversation from protest to solution. He drafted a letter, ran it by 2 attorneys, and sent it by courier to Sam's home. The envelope was thick, professional, and without emotion. Inside, a formal offer to purchase Sam's grill at nearly double its assessed value. The letter was clear. The funds were real. The buyer was anonymous. The conditions were simple. Sam would agree to sell the business immediately, vacate within 30 days, and agree not to open another establishment within city limits for the next 5 years. It was legal, it was aggressive, and it was fair. Sam received it the following morning, just as he was unlocking the diner. He didn't open it right away, but he held it longer than necessary, turning it over, already suspecting what it was. When he finally read it, he didn't react. He didn't crumple it. He didn't throw it away. He didn't call anyone. He just put it back in the envelope and slid it under the register. By noon, he'd taken it out again, and again by 4 p.m. By closing time, he still hadn't made a decision. But he had a feeling that the decision might already have been made for him. By Thursday morning, Sam had read the letter 5 times. Each word was the same, but the weight of them changed. The money was real, more than he could have hoped for, enough to clear his debts, walk away clean, maybe even move somewhere that didn't remember. But the conditions, that was what stuck. Leave the diner, stay out of business, disappear. He told himself he wasn't considering it, told himself this was an attack, not an opportunity. But the numbers told a different story. The diner hadn't turned a true profit in 3 years. Repairs were overdue, his insurance premiums had quietly risen since the protests began, and his bank had called yesterday asking why he hadn't made last month's payment. Still, pride had a way of sounding louder than math. That afternoon, Sam called a meeting with his accountant. It lasted 11 minutes. The numbers were worse than he thought. Without some sort of miracle or a buyer, he'd be underwater by winter. He didn't tell anyone about the offer. That night, Sam sat alone in the diner with the lights off, not for effect, just cheaper that way. In the dark, the place felt smaller, less like the institution he thought he'd built, and more like a room full of booths and bad memories. He thought about his father, thought about the stories he'd grown up hearing, the ones about hard work, about ownership, about keeping tradition alive. But the world had moved, and maybe the tradition was just the problem he hadn't seen. The next morning, he didn't unlock the front door. Instead, he taped a handwritten sign that read, "Closed until further notice." And for the first time since all this began, he didn't care how it looked. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Earl sat at his kitchen table, flipping through a scrapbook filled with newspaper clippings and old photos, some black and white, some yellowed with time. Most were from his military days. A few were family events. But one photo stood out, an image taken in 1964 outside a different version of Sam's Grill, back when it was called Harris Family Cafe. Earl was 16 in that picture. He remembered the day, remembered the sign on the window, remembered being told to leave before he even made it to the counter. He hadn't thought about that moment in years, but now it played on a loop. Not out of bitterness, but because it had come full circle. The same place, the same kind of silence. Different name, different face, same message. Earl hadn't wanted any of this. He didn't want to be in the paper. He didn't want his son pulling political strings. He just wanted a damn pancake. But life didn't work on preferences. It worked on moments. And somehow this one had chosen him. Caleb, for his part, had no doubts. The plan was moving exactly as designed. Quiet pressure, measured exposure, and a door out. What happened next wasn't about Sam. It was about what came after. Caleb had already spoken to contractors, spoken to designers, talked to a nonprofit about programming. If Sam sold, the transition would be seamless. If he didn't, well, the pressure would continue. But something Caleb hadn't expected was how quickly the community was shifting. The protests had evolved into planning sessions. Local veterans met with faith leaders to talk about outreach. A group of teens had started a project mapping historical sites of racial tension in town, posting QR codes around landmarks with digital oral histories. And a downtown business owner anonymously covered the cost of new signage for whatever replaced Sam's Grill. By Saturday, rumors were flying. Some said a Starbucks was coming. Others whispered about a food co-op. A few said the mayor was going to buy the building and turn it into a memorial. But no one knew for sure. The only person who knew the truth was Caleb, and he wasn't saying anything until he got a call from his father. Earl didn't ask about the plan, didn't ask about the protests or the offer. He just asked one question. What happens to him if he says yes? Caleb paused before answering, then said, he walks away, debt-free, quietly. Earl was quiet for a long time. Then, and if he says no? Caleb didn't need to answer that one. They both knew. That evening, Sam returned to the diner. He sat at the same booth he used to reserve for old friends. The letter sat in front of him. He read it again, not because he didn't understand it, but because something about seeing it in that space made it feel different. Realer. He thought about the woman with the folding chair outside his door. Thought about the man who used to bring his daughter in every Sunday and hadn't been back since. Thought about Danielle, who hadn't shown up in 3 days and probably wasn't coming back. And then he did something that surprised even himself. He reached for the phone and dialed the number at the bottom of the letter. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. This is Tom Ellison's office. How can I help you? This is Sam Harris, he said. I'm calling about the offer. There was a brief silence. Then, yes, sir, we're ready when you are. Sam took a breath. I accept. And with that, the diner, his diner, was no longer his. But something deeper had shifted too. Not just ownership, not just money. A crack had opened, and for the first time, light was coming through. The town didn't find out immediately. Sam didn't make an announcement. No thank you for your support post, no farewell video. The sign on the door stayed the same, closed until further notice. People speculated, debated, even argued about what the silence meant. But by Monday morning, a for lease sign disappeared from the front window. And by Tuesday, painters had started working inside. Something was happening. A week later, the truth surfaced, not through gossip, but through action. The new sign went up in the early hours of a rainy Friday, simple black lettering on brushed steel, Unity Kitchen. No subtitle, no explanation, just a name that said enough. Then came the bigger surprise. A press release hit local media by noon. Unity Kitchen to open under new ownership as a nonprofit community restaurant and veteran resource hub. Listed in the credits, Caleb Maddox, founder. A name people knew, now attached to something no one expected. But the final name at the bottom stopped everyone cold. Executive Chef Samuel Harris. There was no photo, no quote from Sam, no apology, just a job title and a name. People didn't know what to make of it. Some were angry, some were confused, others were cautiously hopeful. A few called it a PR stunt. A few more called it redemption. But no one could deny the impact. When Unity Kitchen opened its doors, it didn't look like the place they remembered. Gone were the red booths and dusty blinds. The walls now held portraits of local veterans alongside framed notes from their families. One wall was covered with a mural, bold, bright, showing service members of every background sharing a meal. There were no uniforms, no rank, just people. The menu had changed too. Comfort food, affordable, with daily specials tied to regional recipes and donated produce. Every meal came with an option to pay forward a plate for someone else. On the first day alone, over 100 meals were prepaid. But the biggest change was behind the counter. Sam wore a white apron, no name tag, no speech. He worked quietly, focused, moving between stations with deliberate purpose. Some people avoided eye contact, some stared. But no one confronted him. Not yet. Mid-morning, Earl walked in. The room stilled, just for a second. Then people went back to their conversations, their coffee, their biscuits. Earl stepped into line like everyone else. When he reached the counter, a volunteer smiled and asked for his order. He asked for pancakes. They didn't have them on the menu that day. She offered him eggs and hash instead. He said yes. No scene. No statement, just breakfast. Afterward, he stayed, talking with an old neighbor, then with a high school student who recognized him from a newspaper story. Eventually, someone asked him what he thought about Sam being part of the new place. Earl shrugged. "He's here," he said. "That's what matters." Later, Sam heard about it. Not directly. No one repeated Earl's exact words, but the message filtered through. He didn't respond, just kept cooking. But that night, he stayed after close, cleaning longer than necessary. He didn't say why. Meanwhile, Caleb watched everything from a distance. He hadn't taken an office in the building. He didn't come every day. He wanted the place to grow on its own. He didn't want it to be his project. He wanted it to be the town's. Still, he, he kept track. He saw the photos people posted online, families eating together, strangers sharing booths, kids playing in the little corner reading area. He read the feedback notes left in the jar by the door. Notes like, "First time I felt safe eating out in a long time," or "My dad would have loved this place." But Unity Kitchen wasn't just a diner. Every Thursday, the back room hosted a veterans circle, part support group, part storytelling hour. Tuesdays were job coaching. Saturdays were for high school workshops on history, civic engagement, and food equity. The space buzzed with conversation, music, and energy. Not always smooth, not always easy, but alive. And Sam kept showing up. People kept waiting for him to quit, or to snap, or to revert. He worked. He stayed late. He didn't ask for praise. He didn't expect forgiveness. He understood something that took him decades to learn. Being sorry wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Danielle returned. She didn't say much to him, just showed up one day for training. He gave her space. She didn't ask for an explanation. She just worked. And over time, they found a rhythm. Other former employees returned too. Some stayed, some didn't. But none left with bitterness. The air had changed. The building had changed. The intent had changed. By month's end, Unity Kitchen had served over 3,000 meals. Local news picked up the story, then state media, then national. Not because of scandal, not because of outrage, but because people wanted to believe in a place where change was real. Not just performative, not just a post or a plaque, the real kind. The kind that makes people uncomfortable. That takes time, that forces hard questions, and doesn't always provide easy answers. At the end of the first month, Earl came back on a quiet Sunday. He sat near the window, ordered the pancakes. They were on the menu now. This time, Sam cooked them himself. He didn't deliver them. He didn't say anything. But when Earl finished, he nodded toward the kitchen, and Sam, just for a moment, looked up. That was it. No applause, no handshake, no closure, just a nod. And a door that, for the first time in years, didn't feel closed anymore. Unity Kitchen wasn't meant to be a sensation. It wasn't built for headlines, but headlines came anyway. First, a local reporter wrote a Sunday feature. Then a regional podcast picked it up. Then came the segment on public radio highlighting how a former site of racial division had turned into a gathering place for shared meals and stories. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Sam. At first, he kept his head down. He declined interviews, let others talk. He preferred to be seen through the food, not through a quote. But stories have a way of pushing through, and his name kept showing up in the pieces. Former owner now cooking for community. People wanted a face, a redemption arc. But Sam wasn't playing along. He wasn't interested in performing regret. He didn't care about applause. He cared that Earl came in every few weeks now. He cared that the regulars had become regular again. Different people, new faces, but they laughed, they lingered, they gave the place life. Caleb knew the moment was bigger than the town. He took meetings quietly, spoke with organizers, advocates, foundations. What started as one kitchen was now being discussed as a model, a blueprint. The idea of buying out failing businesses and converting them into community hubs wasn't new, but this story had what others lacked: tension, conflict, transformation, and truth. It didn't feel manufactured. It felt earned. Then the call came. A documentary team based in New York had seen the radio story. They wanted to make a film, not just about the diner, but about the arc, the fall and the rebuild, the people, the decisions, the town itself. Caleb hesitated. He wasn't sure if exposing it all would help or dilute the impact. But Earl surprised him. "If someone else can do what we did," Earl said, "then let them see the whole thing." So the cameras arrived. They didn't glamorize anything. They captured dishwashing, awkward conversations, empty chairs at events that didn't draw a crowd. They interviewed veterans, teenagers, people who'd walked away from Sam's Grill years ago and never expected to return. The filmmakers didn't want a hero story, they wanted a human one. They got it. Halfway through filming, something happened no one expected. Tom Harris Sr. showed up. He hadn't been in town in years. He was in a wheelchair now, living in a care facility 2 states over. But when his son told him what the diner had become, the old man had insisted on coming. No press, no warning, just a quiet arrival late on a Thursday. Sam wheeled him through the front door. People turned. Some recognized him instantly, some only knew the stories. He was older, softer, but there was no mistaking him. He looked around slowly, taking it all in. The mural, the booths, the people. When his eyes reached Earl, he didn't look away. They didn't speak for a long time. But eventually they sat in the back corner, a table for two. The conversation wasn't recorded. It wasn't public. No one knew exactly what was said. But when when Earl stood and Tom was wheeled out, there was a quiet around them that said everything. That night, Tom Sr. told the camera crew one thing. I was wrong, for a long, long time. And I let that wrong turn into something that outlived me. But if this place is what fixes it, then I'm grateful I lived long enough to see it. The moment made it into the final cut of the documentary. The film, titled Table of Brotherhood, premiered at a film festival in Chicago 6 months later. Caleb, Earl, and Sam flew out for it. None of them had ever walked a red carpet. They didn't wear tuxedos. Just jackets that fit and shoes that didn't hurt. The audience gave a standing ovation. Reporters rushed them after. Questions about policy, about healing, about forgiveness. One question stuck with Sam. What does redemption feel like? He answered without hesitation. It doesn't feel like anything. It looks like people eating together. After the premiere, everything accelerated. Unity Kitchen became a case study in university courses. Nonprofits replicated the model in 5 cities within the first year. Veterans from across the country wrote letters, sent photos, donated money. One even drove 2 days just to shake Sam's hand. But success didn't make things easier. There were still protesters sometimes. People who believed Sam should have been shut out forever. Others who thought the whole thing was too political, too orchestrated, too neat. Caleb took the heat when needed. Earl deflected with quiet wisdom. But Sam bore it differently. He didn't argue. He didn't post. He just showed up and cooked. When asked about the backlash, he once said, "You don't get to choose who forgives you. You only get to show up and prove your worth forgiving." By the 1-year anniversary, Unity Kitchen had hosted over 50 community events, served more than 25,000 meals, and trained a dozen young people through its culinary mentorship program. Tom Sr. passed away that spring. His funeral was small, private, but on the next morning, Sam cooked every meal in the kitchen himself. No one asked him to. That same day, Earl received a letter from the National Civil Rights Institute. They wanted to honor Unity Kitchen at their annual conference, not just for what it had become, but for how it had begun. The 3 men, Earl, Caleb, Sam, traveled together to the conference. They didn't speak on a panel. They sat in the crowd, listened, learned. When their story was presented, the audience stood again. Not in celebration, in recognition of what it takes to undo harm, of what it means to rebuild trust from rubble. Afterward, they were approached by the Institute's president. "We'd like to nominate your project for the Nobel Peace Prize," she said. "We think the world needs to see what healing looks like." None of them said anything for a while. Then Sam nodded. Not in disbelief. Not in pride. Just acknowledgement. Because he finally understood. It wasn't about what they'd built. It was about what they'd broken through. The news spread faster than anyone expected. A Nobel Peace Prize nomination wasn't just recognition, it was a spotlight. National media descended on Raleigh, trucks parked alongside streets, anchors filmed segments in front of Unity Kitchen, their voices rising over the clatter of breakfast rush. Headlines called it a miracle, a model, a movement. Some called it a fluke. But everyone was watching. Caleb kept the focus steady. He turned down most interviews, redirecting attention to the work still being done. Earl insisted he didn't want speeches or ceremonies. And Sam, once the center of the storm, now moved through the kitchen like any other employee. He scrubbed pans, he tested soup, he greeted volunteers. Inside the diner, not much had changed. People still came in for pancakes, for quiet conversations, for meetings that had nowhere else to go. A small bookcase near the window now held testimonials. Handwritten letters from veterans, students, neighbors. Some were only a few lines. One simply said, "I never felt welcome in this town, until now." The walls of Unity Kitchen didn't speak, but they held stories now. Stories that filled the air, not with shame, not with guilt, but with possibility. One afternoon, a group of school children came for a field trip. They toured the kitchen, asked questions, made sandwiches for a food drive. Before they left, a teacher asked if anyone wanted to say something. A boy in the back raised his hand. "My dad told me this place used to be bad," he said, "but I told him it's not bad anymore. It's just new." No one corrected him. That week, Caleb received an invitation to speak at a global summit on racial healing. He brought Sam and Earl with him. They didn't speak on a panel. They sat together in the second row, listening to leaders from around the world. When the moderator asked Caleb what the hardest part of the journey had been, he answered simply, "Convincing people that real change doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to start." They returned home to find the diner busier than ever, not just with visitors, but with locals who'd begun bringing friends, coworkers, even estranged family members. The food was good, the atmosphere was better, and the conversation, it never stopped evolving. Sam started hosting a Tuesday night cooking class. He didn't advertise it, just a handwritten sign on the back bulletin board. The first class had 3 people. A month later, there were 15. One night, someone asked him what made him stay. "I couldn't leave," he said. "I hadn't finished yet." Earl came to class sometimes, not to cook, but to sit in the back and watch. He'd bring his scrapbook with him, not to show it off, but to remind himself what it took to get there. Some nights he'd stay behind and close the place with Sam. No words, just dishes and silence that didn't feel heavy anymore. Then, one quiet morning, Earl didn't show up. At first, no one panicked. He'd missed days before. But when the afternoon passed and he still hadn't called, Caleb went to check. Earl was at home, peaceful, quiet, the radio still playing softly in the background. He was gone. There was no big service. That wasn't his style, just a private gathering at Unity Kitchen, a photo on the counter, his jacket on the back of his usual chair. Caleb spoke briefly, reading from a letter Earl had left behind. Sam stood to the side, listening. The letter wasn't about the past. It was about the future. "If you're reading this, it means the work isn't done. Good. That's how it should be. Healing isn't a place. It's a process. It doesn't end when people clap. It ends when no one's afraid to sit at any table, in any room, in any town. Keep going. You've already come too far to stop now." Afterward, they served Earl's favorite meal. Pancakes. Weeks passed, then months. The Nobel nomination didn't win. Another group in another part of the world claimed the prize. But no one at Unity Kitchen felt disappointment. They hadn't done any of it for the prize. They did it because someone had to. One evening, after the last customer had left, Sam and Caleb stood by the window watching dusk settle over the square. "You ever think we'd end up here?" Sam asked. Caleb shook his head. "No, but I always hoped we might." Behind them, the mural glowed under soft light. The painted faces, young, old, black, white immigrant, native-born, stood shoulder to shoulder. No names, no uniforms, just people, connected by the simple act of sharing space. Sam locked the door. Caleb turned off the lights. They didn't say goodnight. They didn't need to. And the next morning, Unity Kitchen opened again, just like always. Same tables, same mission. Because the real work, the kind that changes lives, that rewrites endings, that rebuilds broken things, never finishes with a headline. It lives in conversations, in choices, in people showing up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. And maybe that's what redemption really looks like. Not forgiveness granted, not mistakes erased, but the courage to stay in the room after the damage is done and help set the table again. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. It means more than words can say. Stories like this remind us of the power of change, the strength of forgiveness, and the incredible things that can happen when people choose compassion over silence. We hope it left you thinking, reflecting, and maybe even feeling a little more hopeful about what's possible in our world. If this story touched you, one of the simplest ways to support our channel is by giving it a thumbs up. Leave a comment below to let us know which country you're watching from and what part of the story spoke to you most. We'd love to hear your thoughts and connect with you. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next journey we share. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Thank you again for being here.